Welcome, everyone. I just want to thank you all for spending the next hour with us on this lovely afternoon. My name is Holly Rosenfink. I'm from Neighbors for Refugees. And we're so honored today to be joined by our author, Jessica Goudeau, author of After the Last Border, Two Families and the Story of Refuge in America, an intimate look inside two refugee families and their hope and resilience as they fight to survive and belong in America. The book was just selected as a New York Times Editor's Choice of the Week. And so we're so honored to have Jessica here today. Jessica's written for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Los Angeles Times, and is a former columnist for Catapult. She has a PhD in literature from the University of Texas and serves as a Mellon Writing Fellow and Interim Writing Center Director at Southwestern University. Welcome, Jessica. We'll be honored and we'll be joined in a moment by Jessica and another NFR member, Nazanin Sher, who will be moderating our discussion with Jessica. Nazanin is head of partnership innovation and strategy at Save the Children and has a lot of knowledge about the issue of refugees and immigration. So we're very honored to have you here as well, Nazanin. And we'd like to give a brief shout out to Welcoming America and a brief intro to Welcoming Week, which is an annual week celebration of immigrants, immigration, and refugees in America. We've had several things going on this week, and we're really honored that this event is a part of our celebration. Our partner on this event is Welcome Home from Jersey City, a wonderful organization led by a man named Alan Minta. And I'd like to introduce him he's going to give a very brief introduction to himself and his organization. Alan?
Thanks very much, Holly, and thank you, Jessica, for joining us, and Nazanin for helping us with moderating. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm thrilled to hear from Jessica about her book. It speaks so powerfully to the experience, I'm sure, of many small community-based organizations like ours who are run by volunteers. You know, we work with about 35 families from Eritrea, from Syria, from Nigeria, from Afghanistan, and other countries here in Jersey City. We also work with about 50 individual asylees who stay locally after they're released from detention. But we don't have the access to their lives that you've been able to present in your book. We can only imagine much of what they've experienced. And, you know, we've been able to move from being supporters of the local resettlement agency to running a weekly community program attended by about 100 individuals every week. Unfortunately, it's had to shift online during the pandemic, but we hope it revives soon. I only want to say that I hope that your book moves from the editor's choice section of the New York Times to the bestseller section, and we'll do everything that we can to promote it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alan. Like I said, Welcome Home is a really special organization. I implore all of you to go to their website, welcomehome.org. That's the right URL, right, Alan? Good. Okay. And I just want to give you all a very brief rundown about our format today before we leap into the conversation. We're going to be together for the next hour. We'll be finishing right around 1 o'clock, we promise. And while you're listening, if you have a question, please drop it into the chat box. In the last 10 minutes, we're going to be pulling the questions out and asking them to Jessica and for her response. And we're also recording this conversation, and we'll make the link available to you for your family and friends afterwards. And where you are muted, just to make sure there's no background noise. And that's it. So everyone enjoy the conversation. And thank you so much, Jessica. Nazanin.
Great. Yes, thank you, Holly. And Jessica, it's so wonderful to be here and have this opportunity to speak with you about the book, as Alan mentioned. It's deeply personal for some of us, and yet the themes that you put in there are absolutely universal. And I do believe that it can connect in different ways with every reader out there. So I encourage all of you who haven't read it yet to pick up the book and read it. It's wonderful. And we're grateful for you to come to these events to connect with local organizations. I think we all know the importance of increasing local awareness and deepening our civic engagement.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you know that better than anyone else. You've been so involved in your community in Austin, so we can certainly talk about that. You know what, as Alan mentioned, you know, in this book, what I feel is most compelling is your ability to pick up on the context of the US refugee resettlement program, and then connect that and show the impact on these personal stories and narratives. And then talking about these two young women and Hasna at a separate age, but their journeys and the powerful storytelling that you bring forward, which was wonderful. Before we get to their stories, I'd love to read a couple of sentences from the author's note, which I thought was the initial hook, at least for me, you know, as I started reading it. So you write in your own words, refugee policy is not a single monolithic piece of legislation, but a series of programs and practices shaped by one of the most powerful forces in the American Republic, the will of the people. Americans' national fight for identity, the wrangling about who we once were, how we will define ourselves for each generation, and who we want to become, is the single greatest determiner of who we accept for resettlement. Mm-hmm. Wow, powerful, uplifting, and yet daunting that we have the power in our hands. And I'd love for you to elaborate how you see that American identity and our definition of our identity connected to how it's shaped policy over time.
Yeah, you know, I think that was one of the things that was the most fascinating for me about looking at the history of this. So I come to this project from academia. I have a PhD in poetry from the University of Texas and had no intention of writing a book like this, but instead I spent years researching the way that countries view each other and how that affects literature, and then realized how much that comes into play when we start looking at resettlement. So I always tell people the history sections for me are not a history of resettlement policy. There are a lot of amazing books that have done that, and you can read any of them. This is a book about the way that we talk about refugees. This is the history of the way that we talk about refugees and how that has shifted over time. And I think, you know, the connection between what we see as America and the way that those policies actually affect real people, there's some disconnect that we often have in terms of realizing that our conceptualization of this nation actually tears through people's lives in some way. And so that was what I was trying to show, is that tension. You know, we have these competing ideas of what it means to be America, right? So there's this idea of this country that lives in each of our minds, and depending on your community and your culture and your worldview and your situation, that really shifts. And we can see this in our current political moment, what it means to make America great, or what it means to make America welcoming, or what we mean even by the term America. And yet these aren't just, for a lot of us, for me growing up, this was kind of a theoretical conversation. And yet, as I tried to show in my stories, there are real life consequences for a lot of people, because what politicians think that they are able to pass in terms of policy, their view of what the public is willing to go with in terms of laws or, you know, executive orders or whatever it is, actually has a real impact on the lives of a grandmother who wants to be with their grandbabies, right? Like these are real people's lives who are separated or destroyed because this concept impacts our policies, right?
No, thank you for that. And certainly, and I think, you know, to connect to that is also that we have this notion of the refugees. Mm-hmm. And yet, you know, I can say this, it can happen to anyone. You know,
Yeah.
here we are sitting in our communities thinking, oh, you know, we're good, we're on community, and it really can. I mean, who would have expected in Syria or other countries that there would be civil unrest and there
Yeah.
would be, you know, this chaos, and that, you know, as you say it in your book, it's not that the refugees want to leave their communities and their families and their countries. So that's a great way to start the book, and a good transition now to Muna and Hasna. You talk about your friendship with Muna and your involvement with the cooperative and the refugees. You got to know so many of them, it seems, over the number of years. How did you end up choosing Muna and Hasna? How is that representative of the refugees, of their particular backgrounds, but also in the grand scheme of things? And what might have been some unexpected moments that you discovered through those conversations with them?
These are such great questions. So Muna was an easy choice because she's still one of my closest friends. I have never written a nonfiction book before. I had a lot of theories about how to do that, but the actual reality of it is a lot more complicated. I come from this background of understanding the representational issues that come when white people try to fix or solve or impose our ideas on stories. And so my goal in this was always to come from this direction, to come through friendship, to come through listening. And so in 2015, I was running a writing center and working at Southwestern University. And, you know, I spent 7 years in relationship with several people. We were talking about this before this started, of the like messy, beautiful space that you get into in the local level when you're friends with former refugees. And you know, often someone says, I can cook, or I can weave, or I can sew. And then these cooperatives or nonprofits or projects, or like they're really organic start. And that was my entrance into really understanding who former refugees were. And Muna was there from the beginning. She was my very first friend. And so in 2015, when this rhetoric really shifted, I thought there is this one very unique role for someone who has spent years understanding literature and has spent years being friends with former refugees. And that's, you know, can I at least begin trying to tell your stories? And I reached out to the people that I knew and could not write fast enough to get these stories out. And so that really all began from my relationships with community members. And so when I began writing the book, after we had kind of shaped it together, Muna was an easy choice. Her story, she's someone that I felt like I could connect with personally. I knew her really well. I knew I could push past we had already in our friendship pushed past the polite level to the point where we could really ask some deep questions. And I just know how she thinks. She is a brilliant thinker. Also, she is not someone who's able to tell her story in her own way because she still has family members in danger. And so in the afterword, I talk about how I felt like my role was to tell what needed to be told and to hide what needs to be hidden. And in part, that's because I was able to receive the full story, and then together we could kind of shape it in the way that felt like it was safe for her, but also really important for her. So this whole thing was me, I felt like a conduit for the story that she wanted to tell. And then when I met Hasna, I had been doing, I basically like sent out a call among my friends, like texted people on WhatsApp, you know, I mean, you know how these things go, like those of you who, there are a lot of people in here who know as well as I do. Like you just start texting people who text somebody and then you get a call and you're like, I'm so-and-so's uncle and I have a story to tell you. And I'm like, tell me. So through all of these kind of initial interviews that I was doing, I sat down with Hasna and I don't know, some part of me connected with her in a way that happens to all of us who in these cross-cultural relationships, right? Like this is not something that is like, I'm from one place and you're from another, but like we just had some level of friendship. She is brilliant. She is an incredible thinker. She knew how to tell her story in a way that I felt like I could connect with. And I also really wanted to show what refugee resettlement had been in 2007 when Muna and several people from the Karen refugees and other people from Myanmar came over in this very large group of people that were really well received and had great support, and it was very complicated. And then the real difference between Hasna and other people who came over from Syria in 2015 and 2016 and had a very different kind of experience here, in part because they were from a different part of the world and in part because of our American misconceptions of what it means to be a Syrian Muslim refugee.
You know, it's interesting. It reminds me of one part in the book where I guess in Hasna's words, right? She says, you say that, I wish that the outside world, when they hear Syria, they don't think fear and chaos and terrorism. And because to me, Syria is like honey on my tongue.
Yeah.
And I thought that image of honey on her tongue was just so beautiful, right? As you said, Jessica, their backgrounds are quite different, the context is different, and yet the themes that you touch upon are so similar and universal. And I believe that's what makes the book quite relatable, right? There are moments, I mean, who hasn't struggled in their life, who hasn't gone through grief and loss? So we can all relate to, big parts of that book. I'd love to hear from you. How were you able to, as you said, you put yourself in their shoes and brought out their voice, and yet how someone with your background, and I know you've traveled internationally, and yet, you don't have a refugee background. How were you able not only to put yourself in their shoes, but to walk the walk, truly?
This is one of those complicated questions that I think takes, like, there are some things that we can't do and some things that we have to do, right? So Nazanin knows that I lived in Brazil and Chile and Thailand and have been the foreigner who was frustrated because my language was, like I felt like a child. I felt like people treated me like a child. And so there were moments, culture shock is something that all of us experience who travel. So there were moments of real connection, right? And yet I have always traveled as someone who had the funds to buy a plane ticket to go and tour. And we don't view these things as, like, nobody ever expects me to speak for the tourist experience, right? Like that becomes a rich part of my life. And yet we often view former refugees as if this one visa category is who they are, right? And so there is some moments of connection that we felt, and yet there were real moments in which I absolutely cannot understand. And I wanted to be incredibly careful not to put myself in a position of having to speak for them. And so part of why I don't show up as a person, as a narrator in the book, even though there are some scenes in Muna's life that I was actually in the room for. And I cannot tell you how much I wish I had taken better notes of those years. Like, I had no idea I was going to write this book, or else I probably would have done a better job. And yet I really relied on their own interpretation, their own descriptions, their sense of what was important. And that was what I wanted to bring together. So one of my favorite writers is named Svetlana Alexievich, and she writes a lot about women. She's a Nobel laureate winner, and she does a lot of oral histories. And though the books that we write are really different, she calls herself a persistent portrait painter. And to me, that was what I was doing, but it was almost like a police sketch artist. Like, I was listening to them describe their life. And so they told me where to go, what to say, what happened, what was important. And to do that, it literally took us 2 years, and we met every 2 weeks. For Muna and I, we could do it in about an hour and kind of get through some scenes, or I would come back and ask her a lot of questions. For Hasna, I had Hasna and Amina as the pseudonym of the translator. No one from Syria wants their actual names involved, even the beta readers who read it, because they have people in danger. And they shaped this with me through just hours spent together over, I have 5 or 6 hours of recordings for just so much time spent together. I typed all of that up. I transcribed it. My hands were just fried by the time it was done. And it was through the act, I just got all of this material. And by the time we were done, I was able to piece together all of these details. So to me, the collage feel of it is kind of what I was trying to do, but everything that I got was something from them. So I wanted every detail to really be congruent with them, or to be changed in a way. So to protect their identity, we made some changes, but they had ownership of what they wanted to change, what they wanted to kind of maybe not look at, what they wanted to kind of keep out of the frame.
Maybe just one more thought and question on that. What were some of the challenges, your biggest challenges, as you were going through that process and working through putting that puzzle together?
Yeah. So this is where translation studies was actually really helpful for me. Those of us who have done translation, especially literary translation, understand that, taking a poem from one language to another is an act of violence, and there are things that will be missing. And so it almost becomes a new creation together. And in the same way, I think any nonfiction writing, while nonfiction, is also a creation of a new thing. It's an interpretation of a moment in time, right? And so doing this together was so rich because they helped me translate their experiences into this. And yet we know that there are a lot of things that we're missing. And I have a lot of fears in this. I was so afraid that I would misrepresent their stories. I was afraid that I would put their family members in danger. We had a lot of communication issues. I could not have done this work without Amina. She is the most gifted translator and has become, like, it's not even, friendship doesn't feel right for me to describe the mind meld we had to go through. Like the three of us had to spend so much time in this incredibly intense space. And, for her to do that, she did it voluntarily. We hosted each other over meals. Like we became it's a unique sisterhood that we formed. And I think we had to form that. We forged this incredibly close relationship in order for that to happen. I know some things that I did wrong. I made some mistakes, and I could probably point them out to you. And so I had so many fears that I would bring this over incorrectly. It was a lot of work, but worth it to me, so that it was as close as we could get to what they went through.
Well, thank you for going through this and for writing this book, because, their voice, it is truly authentic. It comes across powerful and strong. And as you just described, it was a lengthy and sometimes painful process for all of you involved. So wonderful. The outcome is wonderful.
Thank you.
There are many quotes out there about falling, getting back up. There's one attributed to Nelson Mandela about, the glory of rising up. The one that I really like is one that goes something along the lines of, sometimes it takes a really hard fall to really know where you stand. And, of course, Hasna and Muna have gone through trauma and threats on an ongoing basis, and fear and uncertainty. And yet they keep finding the strength and the inner motivation to carry on, right? In Muna's case, and maybe because she's further along her journey in this country, you talk about that moment of transformation. And I'm going to read a couple of sentences from that. And by transformation, I don't mean so much forgetting her past, the broken and shattered past, not even moving on, because frankly, there is no such thing as moving on completely and forgetting, right, your traumas. But maybe that moment of reckoning, of awakening, and making peace with your past is how I define it, at least. And so I'll read a couple of sentences here. So in the beginning, early on, her parents' tension in her country's war in miniature, like a broken glass. In a frame, the cracks spread, deepen, divide, but the glass stays in place for now. And then much later on in her story and on her journey, everything changed for Muna on the night she found out her mother had died.
Yeah.
The overwhelming grief that still came in waves did not dilute the clarity she had felt. The epiphany was simple, but the ramifications profound. And in her case, it was quite positive. So, Hasna is at a different moment in time on her journey. The context is quite, with the Syrians, as you said, complex. How would you like to see her moment of reckoning? Has she gone through that? how is that going to evolve, and what does that mean for some of us, in our communities that can maybe help Hasna and the likes of Hasna get on their journey and path towards finding joy and resolution?
Oh, it's such a good question. Okay, so I had known Muna for 12 years when we began this process. I thought I knew the major story arc that we were going to be talking about. I learned within the first conversation I had no idea. And it was such a humbling thing for me. I mean, when I say that I've met with these women, Muna first as friend and then as translator, and we just hang out. When my parents got divorced, she was the first person I called. She has been through a lot and is a good friend. I truly did not understand that the war in Myanmar, her years in the camp and resettlement were just the situation, that her story was one that only she knew, and she was the only person that could tell me, right? And so, I understood the concept of that, but it was continually surprising to me. It was her parents' divorce. It was the death of her mother. It was the tension with her husband. It was having a baby in a new country. Those were the real points of stress and conflict. So when we began, once we kind of had the full story and we began to chart it together, I thought it would be war, resettlement. And she was like, no, it's this. And I think that's such a powerful thing for those of us who work with refugees to understand, because they come through a program. The one thing that unites people who are former refugees is just the circumstances that brought them to the United States or that have made them leave their home country. But the unique hopes and dreams and connections and, the tea towels and the rugs and the homes. And there's so many differences. And it is, I don't know how those of you who do this for your jobs are able to process this. As someone who's mostly done this just as a friend, it is so incredibly complicated to navigate this. But I think the hard work has to be on us to change ourselves in relation to receiving the stories of, recognizing the experiences of, meeting people in their particular context. And, we're never going to know all of these details, but I think being open to and aware of and ready to change ourselves so that we are listening to and elevating the voices of those people that's the hard work that we need to do, right? And so I want to make sure that we always recognize that the story that we're expecting, I don't care how many years we've done this, the story that we're expecting and the story that we receive are very different things. And I think that's a real point of humility that I'm learning, I'm continuing to learn, and I think can be really important for all of us.
It just through, you mentioned work, and through my work, I've traveled quite a bit, pretty much everywhere in the most remote areas, and met the most marginalized communities, right? And yet what has consistently stood out for me is their resilience, their strength, and what we all share at the end of the day. There's no, I'm Persian, that person is Syrian, this person, it's not, or Nicaraguan, or, a Venezuelan at the border of Colombia. We're all human beings, and that's what connects us. We all want the same thing for our families and for our futures, and I think that's really important to keep in mind and put it into context. And I say that because, in the case of Hasna, it's, you talk about family reunification and the policy aspects of it, and at the same time, you tell her story of what it meant to her and what it means to her to be close to her family and in proximity, and having her children and grandchildren with her. That is, that family reunification theme comes across throughout the book. So I'm not sure what we can do about that in our local communities, but who would argue with that we all want to have, families that were, close-knit and can provide support.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add on that, or?
Yeah, no, I just think that was kind of my goal with Hasna's story. The part that we expect comes at the end, and it's a blip for a while. We know that Hasna, just the timeline of it, she came over in 2016, and so we know that Trump is going to be elected, and that might impact what's happening. And yet that's really towards the end of the book. And in part, what I was trying to do with this whole book was take the expected stereotypes and tropes that we have and turn them on their head, right? Like after the last border, we always think people like are grateful and everything's going to be wonderful and aren't they so glad to be here? And I wanted to show that, I mean, the beautiful moments in the book are in the beginning for Hasna. Like her home is beautiful and her family is close. And even when the worst things happen, her sons and daughters are able to work together. They're like this well-oiled machine of like, if someone's working here, then Hasna's taking care of kids. And like this little community can do this together. And I don't want to give too much away, but you know, all of you who are in this community can guess pretty close what happens. And I still feel so stunned by that. And I listened to her talk about it for 2 years. I mean, there's nothing I want more than to be able to show you the pictures of her grandbabies. And I mean, they're precious. I've watched them grow up through pictures. And I mean, my mom would claw her way across the desert to get to her grandchildren, right? Like I cannot imagine what mother or grandmother is going to spend time going, yeah, things are great. I feel fine. I love my new life. My kids are starving. They're in danger. They're barely making it, trying to, you know, get to the places they go. But I'm feeling good. This is great. Like, how can we possibly expect that of people, right? So we use these terms like family reunification or chain migration, which I find so offensive, when it's really like a mom who wants to be with her kids. Like nobody's going to separate me from my children. And I think that we have really lost something in our country when we view these as policies and issues and political divides. Like, I don't know if I agree with that politically. I'm like, these are people. I don't know what we can do about that. That's part of why I wrote this book, is I want people to just hand it to someone and say, look, read this, tell me what you think. Like, how could you do this to her, right?
That's right. We're all going to do that. We're all going to get books and hand it out. I know I have already started, so absolutely. You mentioned, you know, the border, the imagery, and that's another thing that I just found so beautiful. Your use of, you know, the symbols, the symbolism, the imagery to showcase the shared humanity. In the case of Hasna, her encounter with the bird, the hoopoe, which is, you know, very representative across, you know, a number of, you know, in the Arab culture and literature, Persians, Greeks, mythology, and in her case, just showcasing the role of the matriarch. Yeah. And how it was important for her to stay strong, because she knew that was the most important thing for her family. She cannot fall apart, right? So she, even with the heavy burden and weight that she continues to carry, she has to get up and continue for the sake of her family. And so all along the book, you plant these seeds, these nuggets, these crumbs that you leave for the reader. And depending on what our arc story is, what our journey has been, we can pick any one of those, I guess, that is most meaningful to us and try to peel back and uncover, which, you know, I just loved in the book. And I wonder, what are some of the images? I have quite a few that I listed for myself, and I can go through them. But I would love to hear from you. What were some of those images, some of those moments that spoke to you most? And the messages that you'd like to highlight maybe for all of us?
You know, I'm so glad you said that about the hoopoe. I really have hardly gotten to talk about it. And that was like one of the most beautiful conversations. We were sitting in my kitchen, which is in there at the table, and she was just talking about, you know, this moment sitting on the ceiling in Jordan, like the roof in Jordan. There's like a rooftop area where she could hang her clothes out to dry, and across the border she could see her city. And so looking at it, she could see where the missiles were falling. And so she had a kind of an idea where her house would be, and she was like obsessed with watching. I mean, I just cannot imagine the trauma of this, right? And there's a mother bird who comes and sets up a nest, in a whole scene in which she really identifies with the bird. And you know, again, one of the many misconceptions that we Americans often have of Syria is, and you know, almost the entire region is missing the role of poetry in the lives of many people who speak Arabic and other languages, right? So this was a very, Hasna knew exactly what she was talking about when she's talking about the hupo. It's a hut hut, I think, in Arabic. My Arabic is really, really terrible. And it was just, right? But it means so much to her because it connects with all these other poems. I mean, so many, part of my great grief, I wish that I could have written a book like this fat, it was so obnoxious of all the things that she wanted to say. There's so many stories that we eventually had to leave out. And she has so many poetic images that really stand out to her. There were so many moments like that, it was such a beautiful thing to work with the women, and we sort of trained each other and how these are the conversations we wanted to have. And so there was this one moment when I felt like we really had a breakthrough. Muna and I did, when she talked to me about the walls, the paint on the walls in the bathroom. There's a part where any of us who've ever lived in cheap apartments, cheap student apartments or whatever, when you touch the walls after they get wet, it's the paint is about to peel off. Often the paint does peel off. It's that really tacky, cheap paint. And she would talk about how sticky it was. And she had this moment of the first time she took a shower and caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. And she was she'd never bathed in a bathroom with a mirror before, and stuff like that she figured out how to talk to me about. I don't know how to think about that in terms of imagery. I tried so hard not to think about this book how I always have this image of myself from bottom up instead of top down. I tried so hard not to construct a book, and yet I found so often in their language, Hasna would talk about the city of Dara as her mother. And so when the first missiles were coming, that was the image that I used because it was her image, and it was how she felt. She could feel herself nestling against that. And so you see the influence, I hope, from her mind of the poetry that has shaped her into the writing of this book. I'm confident there are so many things that I don't even know are in there because they're coming so directly from both of them to really kind of shape the images that stood out to them, right? The glass frame and all of that. Those are things that we kind of worked on together.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that. And it's very true. We tend to forget these the civilizations and the powerful literature and poetry. So it's a good reminder. Absolutely. You also talk about the life. Yeah.
I will say, just Syrians were writing poetry when my ancestors were living with their cows in huts. It is a long history of poetry and civilization that we Westerners often discount to our shame. Go ahead.
That's right. No, absolutely. No, that's it. You said it beautifully. I was just going to mention that, her connection to nature, the moment she went with her son to Lake Muzayirab, and how that then came back. The Muna in the closet, the image of the lioness. I mean, yes, you're right, in their voices, what it means to them, right? I want to switch now, if you don't mind, for the few minutes we have left, to where we began on the policy side of it. And, you've reviewed now, you've researched, you've written about the evolution of, decades of refugee policy. How do you see that evolving today? And I guess if we had a magic wand and you were a policy advisor, what would be some of the measures that you would tackle first? I know we talked about the importance of the local communities and what we can take on, but then how does that then translate to more the national level and the big picture maybe?
Such a great question. So I'm beginning with the caveat that I'm 100% not a policy person. So I think one of the things that we need to do is make sure that the voices at the table are the people who have been doing this work on the ground and who have ideas that I never will, and are missing things that any one person can't see. And I think that's part of the problem in the past, is we have had these kind of top-down decisions being made about what it means to resettle a refugee, what it means to be a refugee, what's best for refugees. And I think that has happened from the conversations I've heard, not just with former refugees, but also with people who've been working in resettlement for a long time. When that's happening on the government level or that's happening on the political level, there are a lot of big things that are missed. These are people. This is not a pipeline. This is not a supply chain. These are people's lives as they are being moved. the closest equivalent we have, and I haven't really talked about this, but I'm trying to figure out how to think about this, is the witness protection program in the United States. Like, that's something that we have a lot of literature and movies and TV shows about, and it's that, like, people whose lives have been uprooted for federal oversight, right? And so we have to rethink this. I know I've had some great conversations with other people. Hearts and Homes for Refugees is here, and their views on how communities can be doing this work, not just coming through resettlement agencies. I would say these are answers that there are a lot of people in this group that can answer better than I can. I think that we have come to a really horrific time in our country when we cannot even have civil conversations about people whose lives have been through war. I had an interview a couple of days ago with Representative Elizabeth Holtzman, who was the congresswoman who helped write the Refugee Act. And she was like, I don't even know how we got here. Like, what an incredibly dumb thing that we're even having to discuss this. Those were not her exact words. That was not a good quote. At the same time, I think because we are in this place where, 30 years ago, we were having very complex conversations about, ways that we can build community now, and they were bipartisan. Here in Texas, it was conservatives and liberals and, people from all faith traditions, people from no faith traditions, people from the corporate world, people from the nonprofit. I mean, it was just an incredibly beautiful ecosystem that was built around this. And Texas resettled more refugees than any state besides California, and has always been kind of up in the air. So I've watched firsthand how this has gone from this incredibly beautiful bipartisan shared space to this just wasteland of political conversations that we're really missing each other. So it's easy to feel hopeless is my point. Like, I've seen it, it's horrible. Those of us who are in it wake up every day with, I just have a gut. I mean, it's changed my whole life trying to tell people, like, I'm no longer in the career that I was on. Like, this has become such a passion for those of us who see what's happening and feel like sometimes we're shouting into the void, right? At the same time, the conversations that I get to have with you guys and with others around the country is the most heartening thing that I can possibly imagine, because I hear of so many people who are rallying around their local communities. And I have been able to witness firsthand cities across the United States, state governors that are really changing their views. There are counties that are speaking up, and I'm hoping that there is a groundswell of support for refugees in our country. And I think that's the very starting place. And what I hope moving forward is the fact that we've gotten us down so low is actually a chance for us to rethink some of the things that weren't perfect. This was kind of a duct tape solution program, right? It came out of, like, there were a lot of ad hoc policies, and then it was eventually solidified 40 years ago into this. But we've been resettling refugees, and it's just been this, like, well, we've always done it this way. And so Kathy from Hearts and Homes for Refugees made a great point the other day. There needs to be better data. There needs to be better senses for how to, what is actually working across the board. And so there are going to be ways to rebuild. I'm not sure what those are yet. And I feel really hesitant about saying, like, we need to do this. I think what we need to do is have better conversations. We need to talk better about what it means to be a refugee. We need to tell better stories. And we need to come together and kind of create these groundswells of support so that we can rebuild in a more, in a way that will help others thrive and kind of fix maybe even some of the things that have always been a problem.
Thank you. That was amazing. And, you said it so well. I think the key takeaway here is the importance of that grassroots. And we've seen it in our local communities, how when, all of us as neighbors come together, this is not about politics. It should not be about politics. Yeah. This is about people. When we come together, we can create change, and it's quite powerful. So, and I guess maybe that's sort of the call to action to the youth out there and the next generation. It's important for them to engage early on and think through these challenging topics, because at the end of the day, it is their future. Yeah. And we would love to see more of that happen. So before I hand it over to Elaine to go through the questions from others, is there anything that we didn't touch upon, Jessica, that we didn't discuss that you'd like to talk about before we get to more questions? Yeah.
No, I do just want to say, I know when we talked in advance, you were saying you're not a moderator. This is one of the richest discussions I've had about this book. And in part, I think it's because you were able to come to this book as someone who has had years of experience hearing these stories. And so I just really want to thank you for what felt like really, I'm very excited we got to talk about the hoopoe and imagery in the book. Like we really hit a lot of things that are so important to me and I haven't been able to talk about. So thank you for these just really insightful questions. This was just great.
Thank you. That's very kind of you, but it's really kudos to you for your book, the way you articulate everything on every topic and you engage us. You bring the best out in all of us, and it's very passionate. And of course, for me, both on the personal and professional level, I've immersed myself in these topics. But it's really all the credit is to you, Jessica. So thank you. All right, Elaine, over to you.
Well, thank you. So we got a lot of good questions, and we'll go through as many as we can. A quick one, though, is there an audio version of your book available?
There is. There's a website that you guys shared, the Penguin Random House. Yeah, more information on the book. There's a link to find the audiobook. It's on Audible, and it is so, so good. I did not read it. I am blanking on the name of the amazing narrator who read it that I was so excited about. So sorry, Sonila, and I can't remember her last name. There have been too many things in my head today, but yes, it is so good. I highly recommend it.
Great. Can you talk a bit about the choice to start telling Mu Now's story largely from the early days of her family's resettlement in the United States and Hasna's story from the early days of unrest in Syria? The questioner says it's such a rich choice.
Yeah. I was really kind of beginning with, there are a lot of reasons narratively I wanted to do that. And it's because I think the arcs of the stories matched. So part of what I did in telling 3 stories is chart the story that Muna told me and the story that Hasna told me with the history. And I wanted them to turn so you can tell that the chapters kind of hang on cliffhangers around, like now that I'm telling you, maybe you'll notice if you haven't read it yet, that I want them to like move together so that it feels like a braided book. But part of it was because there were 2 misconceptions that I was trying to work past. One is that you come over from the United States and are therefore grateful and everything's over and it's all wonderful. It's the end of every American story, right? Like the white American soldier shows up and saves people and everybody's happy and it's the end and fade to credits. And that's where I wanted to begin the story. And also because I wanted to show from Hasna's experience, in part because it just happened, but in part because I wanted people to really be so deeply immersed in her life and in her world that by the time resettlement came, it feels like to me, like the wrong end to the story. Like it's like this story started and then we just shoved another ending on it. And I wanted that jarring disconnect throughout. I don't want resettlement to be the most amazing, savior, wonderful thing. I want it to be the like, I'm not sure how I ended up here and this really hurts.
Here's another question about your book. There are some questions that people have asked more generally about refugees and things, but this is another one about your book. How did you strike the right balance between approaching your interviews as an expert or scholar or journalist with a sense of what you want to already know and expect to get out of these conversations versus the oral history method of letting the interviewee guide you in telling and also making sense of their own story?
It was straight up oral history. That was such a great question. Yes, it was straight up oral history. With Hasna in particular, it was, I literally stopped coming up with questions. I would have a general feel of where I wanted us to move in time. Like now we've spent a lot of time, after maybe 2 months sitting in her courtyard, I wanted us to move out of her courtyard. Like it's that, like, but I also, like, for Muna, I talk about this a little bit in the book, but Muna is not traumatized in the same way that Hasna is traumatized. Muna crossed her first border, like her stress and trauma of coming over here is high, but Hasna, this just happened. And I was so deeply aware of not wanting to do more damage. And the only way that I could see to do that, there's an amazing therapist here and at Refugee Services of Texas that I talk to. I have friends who are trauma therapists. Like I asked a lot of experts about how to make sure that I was doing this as delicately and yet as deeply as I could. And so a big part of that was just letting her tell her story in her own time. And I learned very quickly that if I turned it, she would answer my question. Whereas if I just let her talk, I can't even tell you that. I mean, the hoopoe was a great example. That was a detail that came out. And she was like, well, there was this bird one time. And I'm like, tell me so much more. And so just, also it let her, there was a gift in that I, like one of the very few gifts I was able to give in this is the space for someone to really be heard. And I do this almost every interview I do. I do so many more interviews than I'm ever actually able to write about. And I've learned just saying, I really want to hear what you went through. I would really like for you to tell me, where do you want to start? I get better stories, but also people really feel heard. And who doesn't want someone to know? I mean, I think about this sometimes, like I'm really tired of teaching my third grader how to handle technology. And I think I can't wait to tell my friends what I've been through. Like, this is a good story. This is a really stupid day. I feel this way. Like we all feel this way. We narrate our stories in our head and we want someone to receive that. And so I feel like more than anything, that's my role as much as possible, is to receive as many stories as I can.
Great. And I think that answers the follow-up question for the person who asked that. So I'm not going to ask the follow-up question. I wanted to say that Omar Kanan, and I probably mispronounced your name and I'm sorry about that, but in response to the story you had about the woman on the roof in Jordan looking over and watching her, potentially her home be bombed, said, it reminds me of when I saw my village being destroyed just a few miles away from me 8 years ago. So,
thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it is that kind of visceral thing that, you know, we can imagine but can never really understand. Yeah. So sorry.
Yeah. And that's pretty much the last question about your book. I don't know if anybody else has another one that you want to ask. Bill Westerman said that we didn't need to cover the general questions about refugees, that they'll be covered in a class. So unless someone has another question that they would like to ask that they feel Jessica is uniquely qualified to ask, you could either unmute your phone right now or your computer and ask that question, or put it in the chat box. Here's a question. Any book tours on the schedule?
So on my website, I have an events page. I am not, it's just me. And so I'm not always the best at keeping up with it. Everything is virtual. But yeah, I have events between now and November, in part because there have been so many, like when we began thinking about book promotion, I said our number one priority is going to be talking to people who were doing this work on the ground. And so I sent an email out to everyone that I could find working in resettlement and just said, like, here's this book, I want to make sure you know about it. And it has been such an incredibly beautiful and wonderful response. And so I continue to have really rich conversations with people who are doing this work and who understand this. So you can go to my website, it's jessicagoudeau.com/events. And I will do my best to keep it updated. Sometimes I miss things.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. Holly, would you like to finish this up? Wrap up?
I think we're really good on timing. First of all, this is one of the richest conversations that we've had as an organization. Nazanin and Jessica, you're like a match made in heaven.
We have so much fun, yeah.
A rich conversation. I feel so fortunate. I do a lot of these for NFR and outside NFR, and this was just beyond my expectations. So thank you so much. So again, everybody, I want to thank Jessica and Nazanin and Elaine and Alan, our partner, and everyone who came today. I also want to mention a few things that we're working on that are coming up, and Elaine has put the links in the chat box. We have a winter coat and boot drive with our friends at Hearts and Homes for Refugees, who are here today with us. Thank you so much for coming, Kathy. And we have a sign-up form for volunteers in the chat box right now. We'd love your help. We also have a fall Zoom series. So if you like this one, I would implore all of you to come to 4 that we're doing in the fall. Very briefly, we have one launching on October 2nd with Edafi Akporo from RDF Refugee Shelter. He's a very good friend of ours, and he just wrote a book about compassion, and I think you'll all really enjoy that one. On October 29th, we're doing a conversation about the global refugee space with someone from HIAS, a Holocaust survivor, and a Syrian refugee and activist who's a friend of ours. And on November 4th and November 19th, we're moving away from all of that and taking you into the wonderful world of food. And we'll be talking about refugees' culinary experience in America with someone you might know very well, named Carrie Brody from Emma's Torch, and Ahud Bata from Fez Turkish Mez, which is a restaurant that we're also working with this week to celebrate Welcoming Week. Honestly, thank you all for spending the last hour with us. It's been such a rich experience, and have a great day. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you guys. This was so good.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you. Love your book. Everyone go buy it. All right. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.